My clock has ticked over to 8:01, which is the official sign that it is time for me to start talking. And I don't have to then be nervous that I'm starting too promptly. So, hi, everyone. Welcome to Why Should I Visit for the month of October. We are this month talking about going to Penang, which is in Malaysia. Where is it, you might ask? Well, hopefully, as per always, I've got a map. The sort of pedants among you will notice that, of course, this is only part of Malaysia. There's the whole other half of Malaysia, the sort of Borneo side, which is not in this screenshot. The other island here is Indonesia. We're talking about Penang. You can see Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, down a little further south. That's the sort of big city in Malaysia. You see Singapore even further down. And as we talk about sort of towards the end of this in terms of logistics of getting to Penang, chances are you're going to be coming into either one of these cities, and they're both awesome as well. But today we are focused on Penang, and Penang is an island. Normally these Why Should I Visit talks are about a specific city, and the city in Penang is called Georgetown. And this area here, which Google Maps actually also labels as Penang, that's the city of Georgetown. But today we're really talking about this whole island. It is I have in my notes here that this is we're talking about tourist Penang, which is sort of what tourists mean when they talk about going to Penang. So this whole island that we're looking at here, it's about 10 miles from side to side. So this is a very accessible sort of chunk of land that we're going to be focused on. And we're going to talk all about the city of Georgetown, all the amazing things you can do there. And we're going to talk about all the cool things you can do exploring the rest of the island as we get into our presentation today. So as per always, we're going to talk about why you're going to love Penang. We're going to talk about what you're going to do when you're in Penang. We'll talk about a little bit of logistics around getting there, getting around, navigating your day-to-day, and we'll wrap things up with question and answer. So as I go through the little talky bit of the presentation, if there are questions that come up in your mind, just type them into the Q&A widget, which is down at the bottom of your screen somewhere, and I'll go through those at the end. Don't worry about I'm going to wait to type it in case he answers it. Just put it in there. It's fun to see things show up. So, why are you going to love Penang? Anyone who's ever talked to me about travel is probably going to guess the first one, which is I would say that Penang and Georgetown in particular is the best food destination on the planet. Certainly sort of per capita, I think Georgetown's population is about 200,000 or something. It's a pretty small city. And like the number of amazing places to get food in the city are just astonishing. And as we get into this presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about why it came to be that Penang and Georgetown has such an amazing food scene, because it's not an accident, or at least it's not purely an accident. So amazing food. We're going to talk a lot about food in this one to make up for the fact that we didn't talk a lot about food in last month's webinar. Penang is also sort of a super fascinating cultural melting pot with a history that will probably surprise you. Malaysia in general is a sort of really fascinating country from that perspective, because it is sort of at this crossroads of trade and of different cultures within Southeast Asia. But Penang actually layers on top of that some additional levels of colonial history that don't quite show up in the same way in other parts of Malaysia, at least in Kuala Lumpur. And so Penang gives you sort of the richness of Malaysian history, as well as this sort of diversity of colonial past. And finally, you're still, basically on the equator, and you're in this ultra lush tropical island, and it is an island. We're going to talk a little bit more about how its sort of island nature shows up in your day-to-day. But what that means is that it's a super cool place to get out and explore in nature. So it's not purely a city destination. There's parks all over the island with sort of scenes like this, these just very lush settings all around. And it's, in part because of that island nature, super accessible and easy to explore, because you can't get lost on an island. So what are you going to do when you visit Penang? Well, as I sort of alluded to, let's take a quick sidetrack to talk about Malaysian history very briefly, a quick deep dive. If you want a very deep dive, this book, Crossroads by Jim Baker, is in English, at least, the sort of canonical history of Malaysia. It's been updated a number of times. It is like 1,000 pages. It's very dense, but it will get you into all of the nitty gritty. But I've got a very quick cheat sheet sort of relative to just Penang here, which is that it was sort of an island that was a very sparsely populated island, at least according to what we know from the archaeological record, prior to the Brits showing up. And well, the Brits originally showed up earlier than this, but they founded the Georgetown settlement in the 18th century. This was the British East India Company. They had promised one of the local rulers that, if they could have the island, they would protect him against some of his enemies. They lied, but, by the time the ruler figured that out, it was too late. And it was part of British India, so sort of trading with and coordinating among all of the sort of regional ports in the area, and then competing with the nearby Dutch ports. And so the Dutch are super active in this area at the time as well. And so you actually have both trade competition and sometimes military competition among the different European powers in this region, sort of in the late 18th century and really primarily in the 19th century. And so what that meant is that you started bringing in people from all around the region, right? So people were coming in from parts of the British Empire in India, and then the sort of Malaysian history is settlement from a lot of folks coming from southern China, people coming from what was then Siam, now Thailand, and sort of coming up from all of the Indonesian islands and just all over in the region. So you had this mix of sort of economic migrants, traders who were settling down, as well as lots of Europeans who were showing up there and settling, at least for some period of time. World War II gets seized by the Japanese and then recaptured by the Brits. Again, still part of the British Empire until Malaysian independence in 1957. There's a long period in there where there's a lot of tension between sort of Penang as this sort of semi-autonomous, self-governing space versus its inclusion in the rest of Malaysia. And then finally, Georgetown itself becomes a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008, which was actually far more recently than I realized, and sort of speaks to how rapidly Georgetown has risen as a destination, at least for sort of Western foodie, hipstery tourists. It's really, since that establishment as the UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008. I can't remember if I have a later slide on this or not, but Georgetown and all of Penang, so as recently as sort of 2000, was this, very sort of economically disadvantaged, poor region with decrepit buildings, which we'll see is part of the draw nowadays. So very poor part of Malaysia, and between a mix of some mix of tourism as well as a sort of nascent tech scene that's now grown quite a bit, it's become a really dynamic part of Malaysia. So as I said, about 220,000 people live in Georgetown. And just to give you a sense of the breakdown there, it's roughly 50% Chinese, 30% Malay, 10% Indian, and then you've got Thai communities, Burmese communities, British, Japanese, German, Armenians, so all kinds of other populations as well. And I think the first time that we were in Penang, you sort of get this feeling of that melting pot nature of the city that you don't always see in other countries, right? Like, in America, we grow up with this idea of a melting pot, and we have people from all over the world, and our society sort of organized around that idea, at least around that myth. Excuse me. But that's really not true in a lot of other countries that haven't had a strong history of immigration. And so in some ways, I think Penang and all of Malaysia in general really had a feeling that was a little bit familiar as an American. So what it means as you're exploring Georgetown is that you're going to see lots of really cool buildings from all of these different periods. Georgetown itself is the old part of Georgetown, that UNESCO World Heritage Site, is a very low slung and primarily old region, right? That's why UNESCO made it a World Heritage Site. Basically, the Brits had a trading post there, built all kinds of British structures and sort of these colonial structures. It then had sort of faded in importance. And so all the buildings were essentially left unchanged, not maintained. And what that meant is that they were preserved. And so then UNESCO applied the World Heritage status, which then in theory is going to preserve them long term. Around the edges of Georgetown, you'll get into much more modern sort of skyrise type things, and as well as sort of corporate campuses and things. So the real heart of Georgetown, where most tourists stay, is sort of very much like this: two-story buildings, usually a shop on the first floor, living space on the second floor, usually or often some sort of interior courtyard space as well. As you walk around Georgetown as well, you're going to see a ton of amazing street art. And I just pulled out a bunch of images over the next few slides. And just to pause on this one briefly, what you're going to see, of course, is the street art applied to what look like sort of very rundown buildings. Now, in part, that's true. Of course, nowadays there would be plenty of money to come in and address these. But it's also true that in the climate of Penang, even a well-maintained building ends up looking pretty rundown pretty quickly without sort of constant attention, because it's very, very hot and very, very humid. So what you'll see is a lot of really cool street art as you walk around the city. It's become a street art destination. That was part of, I think, what led to its sort of renaissance as a tourist destination in the early 2010s, is this idea of street art. And what you'll see, there's a lot of fun stuff, like this rat, which is hiding from a cat that's around the corner here. You see this rat shows up all over the city in different ways. And probably the most iconic piece is this boy on a motorcycle, the motorcycle being a real thing, and the boy being there. Important to probably understand for some context, that the street art is not happening by accident, but is sort of very intentional on the part of the sort of folks running the city. And they've brought in artists from around the world to do the street art, and it is sort of officially sanctioned. And so, it's not that there is some great underground art scene that you might find in Berlin or something like that. This is sort of an approved street art scene, and the city has really embraced that, and has made it a core of part of Georgetown. But what it means is that things like, I believe this piece is repainted from time to time because they want to make sure that it's still there for tourists to come and take photos at. But it's still super cool and really fun to see. Georgetown is also the center of a lot of really cool festivals and activities. And as with many hot climate type places, especially with older buildings, folks spend their time out on the street. There's you don't want to spend your time indoors in a 200-year-old building that doesn't have air conditioning when it's 98 degrees and 98% humidity. You want to get out on the street. And so there's always lots of stuff happening day or night. This is just a street fair that was happening in front of our apartment one day in Georgetown. You also notice that folks are really young in general. The Malaysian population skews much younger. And you'll also notice sort of a mix of dress and sort of cultural conventions. Malaysia is a primarily Muslim country, but it is a sort of melting pot, in the way I was describing, where you have folks from lots of different religious backgrounds. And so you see everything from fairly conservative dress to very, very Western dress, everyone sort of mixing and hanging out. The city is, all of Penang is an island, and there is an entire sort of separate coastal community as well, which are basically fishing docks that you can go and explore. You can actually go swimming off of parts of the island if sort of more of a beach ocean scene is your thing. There's lots of sort of fancy all-inclusive places dotted around the island where you would get nature, not city like this. But you can actually go out on the jetties and explore where people live and fish off of the island to this day. And so that's another part of the city, and the sort of connection back to that trading past is that the docks are still super active to this day. The place that I think is a great way to start out a trip to Penang is by heading up to Penang Hill. And for whatever reason, it's just not well mapped on, or marked on Google Maps, but it's sort of there in the purple section of this drawing. It is a hill. I think sometimes they call it a mountain. In the Midwest, we might call it a mountain too. It's about 800 meters, so 2,400 feet, give or take. So above the city itself. And from up at the top of Penang Hill, you get a great view out over the city in each direction, and you get a great view sort of into the interior of the island, that sort of more rainforest jungle, and you get a view of some of the temples that are built on Penang Hill. You notice in the picture on the left, there's a funicular going up to the top of the hill. You can take a funicular up. You can hike up. What you will see if you decide to do hiking is that folks on Penang are crazy about hiking. It's a really popular sport. There are all kinds of hiking clubs where people get out. It's a social activity, a group activity, and a sort of obviously a fitness activity for folks, which is a really fun way to just interact with folks, and to be shamed by the Malaysian grannies who storm past you going up the hill as you're sweating and huffing and puffing. Speaking of temples, there are temples all over throughout the island and all around Georgetown. And what is interesting about them is that, of course, they're representative of all of the different communities that have settled within the island. And so if you've got a good guidebook or you've got a good guide who's showing you around, they can really help you learn to identify, oh, this type of temple is related to this cultural community. And obviously, temples can be a great way then to seek out the related food as well. So if you're looking for something a little more niche, you might seek out a temple for a particular community and then look at the food that's around them as well, which is something that one of our tour guides was really great about, of connecting sort of, well, we've got this temple here and we're going to go look at all the stuff. And of course, the people who attend this temple have this type of cuisine. And of course, the awesome restaurants are right near the temple as well. But you'll see them both right within the city, nestled within the city, and then temples like this that are just, a little bit outside of the city, that you can come in and explore. And again, our guidebook's really helpful there to understand what it is you're looking at and why it is important. If you go out hiking on the island, you also might find that there are some friends out there with you. There are a lot of monkeys around Penang, and I had a particular run-in with a set of them that thought that I was an object of amusement and did me quite a harass. But it's always fun to see monkeys, so I included a picture of monkeys. We actually saw these on a hike to the Penang Botanical Garden, which is a really fascinating site that has lots and lots of sort of enclosed garden areas, sort of caged garden areas, in order to make sure that they can be tended, and then set within a really, really cool landscape of actual jungle as well. So if you're into sort of flora and fauna of the sort of tropics, definitely a place you'd want to seek out. But I would guess that if you're at this talk, you're probably most interested in food. And honestly, that's all I want to talk about as well. So let's talk about food. Here's a picture of Kat after meal 7 or 8 of a food tour in Georgetown. I think this dish on the left, this is, I believe, it definitely is char kway teow, which I think is Kat's favorite dish in Malaysia, which is a stir fry of noodles and shrimp and eggs. And then there's some black bean paste and all kinds of other amazing bright flavors in there. And so food in Malaysia in general is sort of representative of those different core constituencies that make up the population. So you're going to find a mix of sort of Chinese cooking styles, Indian cooking styles, and then sort of what is now known as Malay cooking styles, which is really sort of the population of that entire sort of Southeast Asian region, sort of drawing upon the Thai cooking styles coming from Siam at the time, before the creation of the modern borders, as well as a lot of sort of flavors coming in from all across Indonesia as well. And so what you'll see then as you explore is you find all these different styles are super accessible. And so you can go right from that sort of, Malay food like char kway teow into Indian food, like this sort of pyramid dosa thing at an Indian restaurant, and then into food that is like this. This is something called nasi kandar, and you get nasi kandar at restaurants that are basically going to be like kind of like a buffet where there's like 50 different things. They're all unlabeled and of course fairly inscrutable to someone who doesn't know what they are. And they're all wildly different flavors that somehow mix together on a plate, all make sense together. And you go in and you stand in line with your plate and you hand your plate to the guy, and he sort of gestures at some stuff and you shrug your shoulders and he just piles some stuff on. And in the end, it's like the best thing you've ever eaten. But this is directly coming out of that Indian history everyone sort of mixes and matches these different foods as you move around within the city. And then you get things like maybe my favorite food in all of Malaysia, really, and definitely in Georgetown and Penang, is asam laksa, which is sort of, as they do it, a really funky, fishy, sour noodle soup that is just absolutely amazing. So just a few food photos to get you excited about going to Malaysia in general. And most of the food you're going to be getting is going to be from food courts and street markets. And so what that means is you don't find sort of a lot of freestanding stalls. There's some of those freestanding stalls, but often they're going to be like within a corner of a block has been carved out as a little food court, which means they've got access to sort of running water and sanitation, and everyone's sort of a standing vendor, which means that they have, really strong incentive to be delivering a high quality product because they're expecting repeat audiences. And, in general, these are stalls that have been run by the same family for years and years, or maybe generations, and handed down. And you can go around and pick what you want, and you sort of order food and pay them, and then go and sit in sort of shared seating in the middle of all of these, and they bring your food out to you. For reference, what you're seeing here is the currency, RM5, RM4. That's about $1 for one of the meals we've been looking at, which is quite a bargain. So the food, I would say, is very accessible to a tourist coming to the city. You're not going to have to struggle to find it. There are some, destinations or certain places you'd go for a specific night market or that kind of thing, which you can find in a guidebook or online. But it's not hard to find the amazing food in Georgetown. You're just going to walk down the street and come upon one of these food courts. Of course, the best way to get introduced to this stuff is with a tour. This is a place where you can either do a group tour, which we've done, where you're going to be in maybe like a minibus, sort of like a 8-passenger van type of thing, moving around with a group. But it's also a really good place, especially if you're going to be there for a little longer, to actually hire a private guide and do a sort of private food tour, because then you can really go deep, explore some things that are not on the normal tourist trail. And I think that's probably one of my favorite travel experiences in anywhere, is a private guided tour we did in Georgetown with a guy who does a series of tours called 7 Meals a Day. And that's an underestimate, an undercount, because I think he fed us about 12 meals. And I was just rereading my write-up from that tour, and I'd forgotten that even after he'd sort of stuffed us full of all the most amazing food in the world, as we were heading back to the city, he made sure to stop off at a few other stalls to get things for us to take home, so that when we were hungry later, we had other food, because he knew he couldn't keep force feeding us, but there were more things he wanted us to try. And so finding, a tour guide who can like spend a day with you, get to be your friend, and take you around a city is, of course, the best way to experience a place with the sort of rich food scene like this. But of course, if you're not, if you're, more of a fancy type of person, you can also do fancy food. This is a bit of a joke, but there are a lot of remnants of the sort of the British time in Penang that are still visible, including if you'd like to go to high tea. This was actually the first time I'd had actual proper high tea. I wasn't sure if you were like expected to eat everything they brought to you, or if you were just supposed to nibble, or what was sort of the proper behavior. So I did my best to look official and fancy while eating tea, drinking tea, and eating various cakes. And of course, there are amazing desserts as well. You get these desserts that I think are becoming more common in the US. If you go to sort of like Taiwanese tea places and that sort of thing. But these dishes that mix either an ice cream or a shaved flavored ice with maybe some fresh fruit, as well as different types of jellies, and then often a sort of a bean, like a red bean or something like that. And I don't know, this was over the top, but also super, super delicious. So you do find some really cool desserts in Georgetown as well. One of the other things that I would actually recommend thinking about in Penang, again, if you're going for food purposes, which I'm just sort of assuming you are, is doing a cooking class. I don't always really go for cooking classes while traveling, because sometimes it can feel like a big chunk of time. And the end result is I learned how to make some stuff I might never make again, because you're not really, it's not like going to culinary school. You're just sort of following someone's instructions as they're talking to you, and they've pre-prepared a lot of stuff. But this cooking class was an exception. This was taught by a grandmother from a particular sort of cultural group. And she took us on a food tour first, or a market tour first, where we bought all of the things we were going to be using for our cooking. And then we went back to her house where we cooked. And she expected us to do a good job. Like, it was not a sort of, ha, this is so fun, woo. It was like, it was amazing. But it was, like 3 hours of her scolding us for being terrible cooks and embarrassments, and, making food that not even a dog would eat and that sort of thing. But in the end, she did eventually approve of our finished products. It was a really fun experience. But cooking class here, it was really fun because it got us exposed to a lot of the ingredients that we don't normally cook with. Of course, given its climate, Penang has access to sort of every possible ingredient you can imagine, and especially in terms of like amazing fruits and things. And so having someone to help you understand how to just work with some of those was just a really fun experience. And as you can sort of see from the group of folks here, it was a fun cross section of tourists coming to the city. From all over the region, and all over the world, really. And so that's always a fun connection to make as well. You do also get in Penang, I would say it's not just food. There are also lots of museums and other cultural destinations. I grabbed this photo out of, because I thought it was too funny, from one of the displays in one of the museums about footwear. What you'll find in Georgetown in particular are a lot of sort of house museums, so that are set in either individual sort of trading houses, or in some of the larger sort of houses and estates within the city. And sometimes there's sort of a general history of Malaysia, or history of Penang, but often there'll be a history of like a particular trading family that will take you through sort of their reasons for their success, and show you all of the things they bought with their wealth, and in their sort of preserved home. And so if you're interested in either just that history, or if you're really interested in things like sort of textiles and other products of the region, there are just countless museums like this. I went back through our blogs, and we went to probably 6 or 7 different museums that all gave you a different slice of that history, really from the sort of 19th century to the first half of the 20th century. So it's a pretty constrained period that they're going to be talking about, and it gave you all of these different perspectives. So definitely in between meals, you're probably going to be popping into some of these museums and taking a look at what they have on offer. So that's my sort of rundown of what we did on in our time in Penang. We're hoping to go back in February for just sort of a hangout type trip, hang out, eat a lot of food, enjoy the city of Georgetown. And if you're, again, more of an adventure travel person, or you're interested in more of that beach scene, that's very accessible as well. I haven't had that experience personally, and so I can't really speak to what that is like in Penang in terms of if you want to go spend a week on a resort. But I've seen the listings on the web and they look very, very nice. And so I don't think you would be disappointed doing that as well. But that does get us to maybe a little bit of talk about some of the logistics. And so that is what my next slide says. So you're almost certainly going to be you are definitely going to be making a connection, at least one connection in order to get to Penang, probably two connections. And it is definitely a destination that warrants some thinking about what your bigger trip is to Southeast Asia. For someone in the US, getting there is, probably a 2-day ordeal, and getting back is a 2-day ordeal. And if you're, a typical American with limited vacation, you might want to think about sort of how long you can carve out, whether you want to whether you have an option to make this more of an extended trip where you bounce around to a few different destinations. I guess if you were very lucky on flights, you could do it in a day and a half, maybe. Probably not, though. So in order to get to Penang proper, the island, the airport itself is on the mainland. So you'll be flying in and then taking a taxi, or in Malaysia, their version of Uber is Grab, which is a sort of a super app that does lots of stuff. But one of the things it can do is get you a car. And so you're just going to take a taxi into the city. You can get there as well via bus or train from Kuala Lumpur. So if you're interested in more of that overland travel experience, the buses and the trains in Malaysia are pretty easy to understand, and relatively straightforward in terms of routing. So especially if you're doing a bigger trip around Malaysia, the bus is a pretty sensible option if you're going to go to the Highlands, which is another region, and then on to Penang. But I would really recommend, if you've got the time, or if you can, claim the time, because you probably have the time, you're probably just afraid to use the time because capitalism has convinced you that you shouldn't be taking vacation. You should consider doing an open jaw tour to elsewhere in Asia. Because what you can do is you can look at where the flights that fly in and out of Penang go to. And what you'll see is there are flights that, go to Penang from Singapore, from Kuala Lumpur, as well as places like Hanoi. And so consider doing a trip where you maybe fly into Kuala Lumpur, spend a couple of days there, fly to Penang, spend some time there, fly on to Hanoi or one of the other destinations that you can get to directly, and then fly back to the US from there. One thing to think about when you're booking that kind of trip, and this is going to be a subject of an upcoming newsletter, anytime you are booking travel to Southeast Asia, you want to focus on getting to the region, and then you want to book any other flights, any sort of intra-region flights separately. So what that means is that, for example, the itinerary I just talked about, if you went on Google Flights or Kayak or whatever your preferred booking site is, you would say, I want to fly from Minneapolis. You would say, I want to do a multi-city trip. I want to fly Minneapolis to Kuala Lumpur. And then you would say, I want to fly Hanoi to Minneapolis, right? And you put your start date and your end date. And that's all you would want to book through your sort of Delta or whatever region, whatever international carrier you're using. And then you go back to your Google Flights, to your Kayak or whatever, and there's where you put in, I want to do Kuala Lumpur to Penang and Penang to Hanoi. Because essentially across all of them, the intra-regional carriers in Southeast Asia don't have partnerships with the American carriers for sort of code share and shared itineraries. And so what that means is that if you were to just go to Delta and say, I want to go Minneapolis to Kuala Lumpur and Kuala Lumpur to Penang and Penang to Hanoi and Hanoi back here, they're going to try and figure out a route for you, but their route is going to be like Minneapolis to, probably Minneapolis to Seoul, Seoul to Kuala Lumpur, maybe to Singapore, Singapore to Penang, Penang back to like Taiwan, whatever, because they're just trying to find any flight that's within their system that can get you there. What you'll also find is that all of those regional flights, and especially the national flights, I was just looking today, in fact, flying Kuala Lumpur to Penang, if you book it separately, is $30. If you book it as part of your sort of itinerary, and this is you would never do this, but the difference between flying sort of Minneapolis to Kuala Lumpur and Minneapolis to Penang is like $2,000. And so be smart about booking your travel to Southeast Asia. This is sort of generally true elsewhere in the world as well, certainly in South America to some extent, but the US carriers in particular have better networks into South America, and usually you can get many places direct from the US and South America, whereas in Asia, you know, especially coming out of the Midwest, like you're almost certainly going to fly to either Seoul or Tokyo, and then everything after that is kind of a crapshoot in terms of getting around. And so, you know, just be smart about your booking. That was a bit of a side trip, but I hope that's useful to anyone thinking about travel. I'm always happy to sort of help people figure out how itineraries might work. So friends, hit me up if you ever want to chat about that. Once you're there, it's worth keeping in mind that depending on the time of year, it's either going to be hot or like stupid hot, and it's going to be very humid. And so just like when we talked about traveling in Vietnam, you need to be aware, you need to let your body adjust. You need to bring the right kind of clothes. So sort of loose fitting stuff that's going to dry really quickly. Probably want stuff that's going to, you know, cover your legs and your arms just to, you know, keep the sun off you a little bit. Air quality can also be an issue, and it was for us because basically you have lots of intentional burns in Indonesia to clear land for palm plantations, which in theory isn't happening anymore, but I kind of think it kind of is. And that smoke all basically blows over and sort of can cover Penang. So it's just worth being aware of if you are someone who is very sensitive to that kind of thing. You're probably going to be traveling with a mask anyways. You may end up deciding you want to wear that, especially when you're outside. Much of the population is going to speak English, especially true in Georgetown, again, because of that British history. Elsewhere in Malaysia, you're going to get much more sort of folks who are only speaking Malay or who are speaking like Malay and Arabic or other languages. But in Penang, you get a lot of folks who speak English, but they've got this really fun version of English that is a little bit adjusted, that's bringing in some Malay words and intonations. And so I have a note here that oftentimes they're sort of going to end things with la. And so, you know, much of the population speaks English la, which is, I think, very charming. Certainly, if you're looking at a trip right now, and because I can share, tourist infrastructure is clearly still recovering. Malaysia had a really rough go of it with COVID-19. They had very, very strict lockdowns. They were completely cut off from international travel up until late this summer of 2022. And even within the city, they had movement control orders in place so that you couldn't even travel within cities. And so for a place like Penang that is really dependent on tourist traffic, what you'll find is that sort of accommodations, especially Airbnb accommodations, a lot of those have come off of the market, and even a lot of hotels have closed. And some may reopen. It may take some time for others to sort of be reinvented under other names and in new designs. So definitely a place where I would still recommend a guidebook. Lonely Planet makes a really good guidebook to all of Malaysia, and they'll cover all of the important sort of museums and that sort of thing. But when it comes to looking, especially for your accommodation, you may have to do a little hunting around, and a lot of the things you find in a guidebook might not be there. And you can eat everything. And what I mean by that is this is not a place where you need to worry at all about sort of hygiene standards, about tainted water, anything like that. You should feel as confident going out and eating anything and everything in sight as you would in your hometown here in the US. Maybe more so if your hometown is Flint. And so you should absolutely feel like you can eat fresh veg, fresh fruit, iced beverages, frozen desserts, all the things that are sometimes on the, maybe avoid lists. You should feel totally confident eating that there, eating that in Penang. So that is what I have to share about. It's funny, my watch just notified me about available housing in Penang, which is not at all creepy. So that is what I had to share about a trip to Penang. Next month, if you're able to join us on November 15th, we're going to be talking about Tokyo and Kyoto. I know normally I only do one city, but I felt like if I tried to claim that I was giving you a full tour of Kyoto or of Tokyo, I don't know, like I will tell you about like half of 1% of Tokyo, and then we'll talk a little bit more about Kyoto because it's a little bit more manageable. Tokyo is a very, very big place. But because Japan is finally open to tourists again, I thought it would be fun to talk about what you might put together on a trip to Tokyo and Kyoto, and talk a little bit about how to tackle places that a lot of Americans feel a little intimidated traveling to because of the size and the cultural differences and the costs and all of that. So I hope you can join us there. And with that, I will look at my Q&A. Kat nudged me to say I didn't actually define an open jaw tour, I guess, directly, but an open jaw trip is any time that you fly into one city and out of another. And that's again, something I think not nearly enough Americans take advantage of. We're so used to doing round trip bookings, which makes sense if you're like, going to Kansas City or something. But if you're going to Europe or you're going to Asia, anytime you're on your booking site, usually it just defaults to round trip, but you can go and say multi-city or multi-stop or something. And that just means you're going to put in, from Minneapolis to Amsterdam, and then from Paris to Minneapolis. And you can chain together as many cities as you want in one of those itineraries. But what it means is that if you want to like take the train from Amsterdam to Paris, you can then fly home into another city. And in fact, for those who are into the sort of travel hacking way of life of trying to figure out the lowest possible airfare for things, that can be a really effective way to get lower prices by sort of being clever about how you chain those itineraries together. And another question just about languages and whether there are any barriers there. Certainly you have, I think, as I said, in Georgetown or on Penang in general, English is spoken widely enough that you can really get by just fine in English. I don't even know what I would recommend if you were going to, sort of pick up other phrases. You can certainly look at sort of learning a few Malay greetings, but in Penang, for example, I would not be surprised if the next most commonly spoken language after English is actually Chinese. So you have a lot of different languages in flight there, and it you have a lot of sort of semi-closed communities as well, where folks are only going to be speaking Chinese. And so I don't know that you would need to worry too much beyond just getting by in English and your big tourist smile. So that is what I've got to share about Penang. I really hope you'll put it on your list if it wasn't already on your list. I think it's a very accessible sort of first destination if you're not traveling in, if you haven't traveled in Southeast Asia frequently. It's not nearly as overwhelming or intense as a Hanoi or a Ho Chi Minh City or even a Tokyo. You're going to be able to get around walking really easily. You're going to be able to learn your way around. It's a small, manageable place. With amazing food, and it's still going to be different enough from home that you're going to feel like you're sort of getting the payoff for all that distance that you traveled. So definitely put that on your list. So with that, I will say thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you'll join us next month. I think we might do one more in December. Have to wait and see how holiday travel looks. So thanks, y'all.